Now, right away, the investigators had to question if maybe Neil and Alan's deaths could it all be connected, right? But to be honest, they weren't so sure because remember, they were confident that Alan's death was personal. So that kind of complicates adding another victim to the list. Not to mention, Alan and Neil, they just did not really have much in common. So it didn't seem like these two people could really just fit one person's MO. But the detectives did have to admit that two bodies showing up within months of each other, both brutally murdered and mutilated, this was kind of a red flag. And when Neil's remains were examined for any kind of evidence or cause of death, the investigators were left stunned because Neil had died of the exact same injuries that Alan died from. Major blood loss from an anal injury. So in no world at all could this have been a coincidence. It was calculated. This had to be the same person. Or so you'd think. Because from what I can tell, it seems like the investigators were still not connecting the two deaths at this point. And just like with Alan, the detectives came up with what they thought was a reasonable explanation for why someone would have murdered Neil. It didn't take long for them to figure out that he had those drug and alcohol problems. So it made sense to them that he had probably just pissed off some drug dealer or owed money to somebody. And they were so confident about this being a possibility that they made it very well known to the public. And while, yeah, sure, I guess that's possible, I just don't see how the very specific anal injuries to both victims weren't a giant red freaking flag. So even though the investigators were looking into Neil's background, they were trying to find out why two people, Alan and Neil, who seemingly had nothing in common, had become victims in two separate brutal crimes. And as it turned out, Alan and Neil may have had more in common than initially thought. You see, there were some potential questions about Neil's sexuality. The weekend before Neil's body turned up, witnesses claimed to have seen him at two different gay bars in the area. And remember, witnesses also claimed to have seen Alan out at the gay bars in town the night before he went missing. And there was even more that connected the two of them. The authorities just didn't realize it until it was quite literally sitting right in front of them. While the investigators were looking into Neil's murder, they were still trying to figure out what happened to Alan. And even though Bevon, that guy who that random tipster claimed was Alan's killer, had already been interviewed, the police were still open to the idea that he was somehow involved in all of this. And they really also had nothing else to work with. So they interviewed Bevon again, maybe hoping that something would be different this time. Maybe he would slip up and admit to knowing more about Alan's case or knowing Neil somehow. And this time, he wasn't even interested in talking about Alan. Instead, he specifically asked the investigators about Neil. And this really threw them off because they hadn't at this point even mentioned Neil, and they weren't even planning on mentioning it until they got what they needed out of him. So the fact that he was kind of like inquiring about Neil and about the investigation into his murder, it was strange to say the least. And when the detectives basically said the exact same thing, Bevon admitted that he honestly was just curious about any updates in the case because he had in fact known Neil. Not just known him, but he admitted that he and Neil were once lovers. And that's not all he said either. Apparently, their relationship was years before, and they lost contact after things ended. However, he claimed that they had reconnected just days before Neil's body was found. And guess where they were hanging out? None other than at those gay bars. So now we have Alan and Neil, both last seen out at these bars, both being murdered in a very brutal and very specific way, which, in my opinion, seems like a dig at the fact that they were both potentially gay men.